Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Treatment-Free Beekeeping Podcast. On this episode, number 62, I have for you someone I met up in Alaska here a few weeks ago when I was up there doing the beekeeping symposium that no doubt you heard about as I advertised it on this podcast. So this is Tracey Smith. She is a beekeeper up in Alberta, Canada, outside of Edmonton. We met, like I said, in Alaska. We hung out a bit and had a lot of fun talking about bees. And so I invited her back on the podcast, and she was kind enough to come on and talk about northern Canada. Well, northern for us, for her, it's just normal beekeeping. But, as I say all the time, all beekeeping is local. So sit down and listen to a conversation with a very intelligent person on beekeeping up in the Peace. Tracey, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Solomon.
So I met you up in Alaska when I was up there a couple weeks ago, and I was really interested to hear about your experience up there in, what do you call it, the Northern Prairies?
Yeah, the prairies. I mean, once we're in Canada, we don't call it the Northern Prairies anymore.
It's just the prairies. So that's good.
Just the prairies, yeah.
Well, why don't you start like we usually do and tell us how you got into beekeeping?
I used to live up in Alaska, in Fairbanks, Alaska, and one summer up there I did an internship at a little organic farm, and that farm had bees. And so I got my first contact about 10 years ago with these couple hives of bees at this farm up in Alaska. And shortly after that, I found out that Alberta was actually a huge honey producing part of the world. And I was from Alberta. And so I decided to leave Alaska, move back to Alberta, and start beekeeping. I beekeep now right in about the middle of the province, just outside of Edmonton, Alberta. I've had about 70 or 80 colonies for a number of years now. I worked with someone who had a couple hundred colonies for a couple years. And I learned from beekeepers in my area who have been beekeeping for many decades now, some of them. So that's a bit of my background on beekeeping. I guess I sell a lot of my honey at farmers markets, and I'm really known more in my local area as really a honey seller. But I've also helped do some winter work, is teaching workshops and stuff around here. But I sell a lot of honey, and I have a few colonies of bees too. So.
And by a few, you mean?
I put into winter about 80 or so. And then I sell my queens as well, and I sell a few nukes. Mostly I just breed queens and make nukes for myself though. So, yeah. Awesome.
Mm-hmm. What are some, where should we go with this? What are some of you've studied into a lot of the history of beekeeping in your area up there in the, what I like to refer to as the frozen north. Just everybody should know that it's really quite nice up there, especially during the worm season. And when I was in Alaska, it's not frozen year round. It's really quite nice in the summertime. But you've studied the history of beekeeping in your area, and you've discovered that, well, one of the effects that I heard in one of your talks was about how the availability of cheap packages kind of caused the traditional overwintering methods to be, if not lost, de-emphasized at least. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So, and I'm not an expert on the history of beekeeping in Canada. There's many people who have been beekeeping up here for far longer than I have been. But my understanding of reading historic literature on the topic is our Eastern Canadian beekeeping, so Ontario and Quebec, is very, very old. Similar to this settlement of the continent, the beekeeping on that side of the country is a lot older, and the overwintering methods historically have been a little bit different, because the beekeeping methods on that side of the country have been a bit different. And then as the prairies were settled, and I mean, our Canadian prairies weren't settled in any large degree until the 1880s, more or less. And so beekeeping naturally moved west as the settlers kind of moved west. And so the first bees I've heard of in Alberta were, they came to the province somewhere around 1906. And at that time, people had no choice but to overwinter them. And so from the 19-teens into the 1920s, people were overwintering bees on the prairies. They were using tar paper wrapped around the hives with straw stuffed in between the hive and the tar paper, and then more straw on top, or just grass, too, long grasses that they would cut to provide extra insulation around the hives. Then in the U.S., in the 1920s through 30s and 40s, they figured out how to produce packages and ship packages of bees economically and successfully. And as the beekeepers in the U.S. learned how to produce and ship these packages, the major destination for them was Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, I imagine. And so the package industry in the U.S. really, my impression is it really grew with beekeeping in the western provinces of Canada. And so as we expanded our beekeeping industry on packages, those initial early practices of overwintering our bees here fell to the wayside a bit, because we could get inexpensive packages and not worry about all the care that was required in the fall in order to successfully keep bees through the winter. And that didn't change. By the time you get to the 1970s and 80s, I'm told that very few beekeepers actually overwintered their hives in Alberta and Saskatchewan anymore, that most people would kill their bees with cyanide gas in the fall and then buy new packages in the spring. I think there were actually quite a number of beekeepers who weren't killing their packages, but that's the conventional story that you hear all the time anyways, is that the Western Canadian beekeepers were really reliant on packages coming out of the U.S. In 1987, the border was shut to live imports of bees between the two countries, and that ended the importation of packages from the U.S., the continental U.S. And so now we ship most of our packages from New Zealand and Chile, I believe. But it forced us to begin overwintering our hives again, and really perfecting the art of overwintering colonies in cold climates. And so today, our beekeeping industry, we have our average winter losses are somewhere around 15% as a province. And we have about somewhere around, I believe, 350,000 colonies of bees in Alberta. So as an industry, it's doing quite well right now. Yeah. So that gives you a bit of history on beekeeping in Western Canada, I guess.
That's good stuff. Well, one of the things you were concerned about, with one of the concerns that you voiced to me about internet beekeeping and treatment-free beekeeping in particular, was that people try to homogenize methods around the continent, and so some of that local beekeeping focus is lost. And in your case, especially, you've got an area where, beekeeping is, let's admit it, maybe a little harder than in other places because of the winter weather. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So in Alberta, we do have winters that make beekeeping hard, but then in our summer times, the interaction between our temperatures and our moisture and our types of soils and the plants that we have growing here, it makes for phenomenal summer beekeeping. And so we get these intense nectar flows where most of our honey crop comes in about a 6-week period. And that average across the province, we get about 150 pounds of honey in basically 2 months. And so it makes for a lot of specific management for this region. And so when I say that beekeeping is really a local practice, it's coming out of an area where it has cold winters, but the most intense honey flows, one of the most intense honey flows of anywhere in the planet, is my understanding. And so quite often for my area, people using the internet are learning beekeeping practices from other regions that don't necessarily work that well in an area with a very short season with a very intense nectar flow. And so when I say beekeeping needs to be kind of relocalized, there needs to be an awareness that every region of North America has a different climate, a different winter, different moisture regimes. All of those things affect how you do your seasonal management of bees. And if you don't have if you're learning your seasonal management practices off of the internet, you might be learning how someone in the northeastern U.S. manages their colonies, where you're down in Arkansas, and the timing of the methods at least might be very different, or one area might need to consider certain practices that in the other area are irrelevant. And so it's a dangerous practice to be learning all of our beekeeping from the internet now. It's homogenizing a set of practices across the continent that aren't necessarily the best practices for your specific region or our specific region. So yeah, that's kind of, yes.
Yeah. And one of the examples I thought about, I don't know if I told you this, but one of the examples I thought about was when I was in Arkansas, I could make a nucleus hive with a queen cell and 1 frame of brood and 1 frame of honey. When I moved to Oregon, that 1 frame is not enough anymore. That 1 frame of brood doesn't keep the queen cell warm enough and doesn't give it might survive, but it's definitely not an optimal situation. And it seems like the further north you move, the more frames of brood that you need to have a successful nuke.
I'm not sure. So up here, we do the single frame of brood, or we have tried doing the single frame of brood with a frame of honey, but we would add a couple extra shakes of bees in there to make sure that there's a big enough kind of cluster to be able to cover that brood area. And 1 frame nukes like that they're more experimental than common practice, I think. And depending on your region up here, you can get away with it sometimes. Much more common for here would be building maybe 3 frames of brood. It depends on the beekeeper. Beekeepers do different things up here. But the key part is shaking extra bees in there to make sure that there's enough bees to cover that whole brood area, which in a warmer climate, you probably don't need to worry about chilled brood quite as much. But here, nighttime temperatures are getting down to the 40s anyways, for sure, any night of the summer. So. Yeah,
and that's definitely not something further south we experience. Well, speaking of the cold, let's talk about insulation, because I don't insulate my hives here. That doesn't seem to be a major problem. But with the standard Langstroth hive style, you're only looking at 3/4 of an inch of wood. So insulation is probably pretty necessary up in your area.
In the wintertime, well, the beekeepers up here, they always say it's not the cold. The bees can handle the cold. It's the changing temperatures that they have trouble with. So we add insulation typically not for the absolute temperature, but for the variability in the temperature. That's what, because if you're expanding the brood nest and then you have a period of cold temperatures, the bees will contract their cluster size and all that brood on the outside will get chilled. Whereas if you have insulation, they can, when the weather gets colder, their cluster doesn't need to contract so much, and so they can cover a larger brood area still. And so it's more the fluctuation in temperature that we are concerned about than the absolute cold temperature. The bees can do quite well in the cold, really. But yeah, and so our insulation is typically R8, R10, maybe R12 on the sides, and then up to R20 on the top for the winter time. And in this summer, some people are experimenting with the polystyrene hive bodies, but historically they haven't been used very much in Alberta.
Well, I was pretty intrigued by the way that you insulate your hives on pallets. Could you talk about how you do that?
Sure. Do you mean just the kind of Western style black plastic? Yeah. So I'll go back a bit again. When beekeeping existed in the eastern part of the country, the apiaries were very stationary. And I imagine this is the same in the U.S., in the northeastern U.S. Some very, very old apiary sites they were permanent. And so the beekeepers built wooden boxes that they would put around their hives every year. And they would fill those wooden boxes with wood shavings. And so they were very heavy, resource-intensive winter wraps. Basically, you were building little garages around 4 packs of bees. And so you have 4 hives, like 2 hives beside each other and then 2 hives behind those. And then when beekeeping came to the West, I don't know if it was because of a lack of wood or a lack of resources. One beekeeper told me he thinks it's the apiaries in the West were moved around quite a bit more. They weren't the long-term stationary apiaries like we have in the East. And so we developed what's called a Western style wrap, and they're quite possibly used in the U.S. as well, I'm not sure, where it's basically some type of batting insulation, like a fiberglass batting or a rock wool insulation between 2 layers of plastic. And so there's black plastic on the outside or black tarpaulin on the outside. And then the inside can be the black tarpaulin as well, or you can just use vapor barrier that you would use in a house for the inside of the wrap. And then you just kind of drape this over. We typically do the 4 hives under one wrap again, but you can do 2 hives. You can do a long line of hives under the wrap, or you can wrap it as a single as well. We always put an entrance reducer on the bottom of the hive, like on the entrance, and then have a top hole for ventilation. So that would be our winter lid, has somewhere around an inch, 3/4 of an inch to an inch and a half entrance on the top. Just kind of on the side of the inner cover there, which I'm sure this probably is in the U.S. as well. And so every hive ends up having a top entrance. This kind of black sleeping bag is put over the hive, and then the bees just form a cluster inside each hive and eat honey to stay warm all winter. They can go out through the top entrance on warm, sunny days, and they may or may not make it back into the hive. And that's basically how they overwinter. So, yeah.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the preparation you need as far as feed, making sure they have enough honey stores, what size of hive, overwintering nukes, anything you can talk about in that direction.
Yeah. Okay. The typical hive in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba is overwintered as a double, so 2 high. There's a trend now towards experimenting with overwintering singles outdoors. I should say beekeepers in the north, we overwinter outdoors typically, and a lot of people will overwinter part, or some people overwinter all of their bees indoors in the wintertime too. And so when you winter indoors, you control the temperature you keep it at about 38 degrees Fahrenheit. And indoor wintered hives can be quite a bit smaller than outdoor winter hives. And so indoors, people will do 4-frame nukes, 8-frame nukes, singles. And then outdoors, typically, people will do 2 brood chamber high, so doubles, in 4-way wraps. And those doubles we typically say they should weigh about 120 pounds going into the wintertime. And so we aim for 70% honey and 30% sugar syrup, with the idea being that the sugar syrup produces fewer waste products, so the bees digest it more cleanly, and that means that they don't need to get out of their hive and go to the washroom more often, which is a big consideration when it's cold for long periods of time. So we do aim to have about 30% sugar syrup in the hives. That 120 pounds is really when you go up to the hive and you lift it from the front side. If you go to lift it and go, oof, that's really heavy, like, oh, I can't move that, oh my gosh, that's so heavy, that's basically how heavy it needs to be. But if you can kind of pop it up a little bit still and sort of bounce it a little bit in your hand, that's not heavy enough. And so that's the way most people do it, is just if you go and try and move it and go, oof, that's way too heavy for me to lift, then that's heavy enough for the bees to make it through the winter. Once people right now there's a shift towards overwintering in singles outdoors. And with that, I don't know as much about it, but you need to be a lot more careful with exactly how much they weigh going into the winter, because the margins for error in a single are very small. They need to be supplementally fed in the springtime. And so you're trying to time it so that they're running out of feed just as you're able to get in and supplementally feed them. And so you have to make sure they weigh enough that you have a couple weeks wiggle room in the spring for bad weather and stuff, if you can't get in and feed right away. So it's really overwintering singles in a cold climate is kind of advanced beekeeping for people who have been beekeeping for a very long time. It's a lot easier to successfully get them through the winter in 2 brood chambers. There's a lot of experimentation. People as well will keep in 3 mediums. And then and that's some commercial beekeepers, just to save on lifting, will keep in 3 mediums instead of 2 deeps. And people are experimenting with a double 8-frame equipment, and they seem to overwinter well. But then it seems like they often have swarming issues just because their season is so intense. The population explodes and then they swarm instead of collecting honey. But in terms of overwintering, the 8-frame doubles seem to work quite well too. So yeah, that kind of covers a bit of the feeding, I think. So how much they need to weigh. Yeah.
You talked a bit in Alaska about moisture issues and how you struggled with those early on and figured it out by linking moisture with feeding.
Yeah, if when you feed the heavy syrup the 2-to-1 sugar to water mix, that still has a lot of water in it. They need to the bees need to evaporate out a lot of water in that before they can store it and use it. And so when you start feeding them, you need to feed them really intensely. We usually use the pail feeders on top, the inverted pail feeders, a 2.5 gallon bucket. And then just feed for a couple weeks, 3 weeks. And then hopefully you're done feeding them, because they need to have, I think it's around about a month between when you stop feeding to when they're consistently in a cluster now and not dehydrating their food anymore. They need about a month to be able to evaporate all the excess moisture in there. And if you feed them too late into the fall, and they don't get a chance to evaporate out that excess moisture, that's when you end up getting moisture issues in the hives. As Solomon, as you mentioned, I showed some photos in a presentation about one hive I had that got dysentery quite badly, and ended up dying through the winter. And there was mold on the outside frames and stuff. And that was because I fed right up to freeze up. I didn't stop feeding about a month early. I didn't know to. And then you could see the sugar syrup had all fermented in the comb. It was all just runny, fermented mess in the comb because I'd fed too late. So that was my lesson in feed early, finish early. Commercial beekeepers around here, they're often done feeding by September 10th, September 15th. Some will go to the end of September feeding. I always hope I'm done by the end of September, so that they have October to dry everything off. But there's, feed early. I think that's one of the big mistakes that people in my area make when they're starting out, is they feed too late, or they keep feeding too late.
Yeah, I think that we have the same problem here in the U.S. You'll hear cases of where people will find their hive light, and probably even later than September, October, and they want to feed so that the hive will survive through the winter, but they end up feeding until the bees quit taking it, around when it starts to freeze. Yeah. And then they have moisture issues. And I don't know that that's really been well documented as a connected situation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can see, and I think that's what people fall into, is they're worried their bees don't have enough food, and the bees will still take more food, and so people keep feeding, and it ends up being too late for them to dehydrate that extra moisture out. That's why we use the pail feeders on top, because if you're using a frame feeder inside the hive, those black frame feeders, the bees can't you can't feed them quickly enough. The bees can't take that sugar syrup in quickly enough. And so you run out of time in feeding. Your hive will be too light still, but it's too late in the year to feed them more. So the trick is feeding them just a massive quantity at once. And so that's why we use the pail feeders, to just get a ton into them all very quickly.
And just to reiterate, you're using heavy syrup at this point, right?
Yeah, 2-to-1. Yeah.
Now, in treatment-free beekeeping specifically, there are quite a number of, let's call them purists, who are against feeding altogether. What would you have to say if someone were trying to take that approach in your area?
I tried it just as an experiment. I like experimenting all the time. And so I tried it on one of my hives 2 winters ago, just one hive. I didn't take any honey off of it. So it means they packed out their brood chamber. with honey. So I didn't have to feed them in the fall. I figured they weighed enough. I didn't need to feed them. And so I didn't wrap them and I didn't feed them. I put them in a really nice south-facing protected area though. And they lived through the winter. And so my conclusion was, I don't need to feed. I don't need to wrap. My bees lived. But then they were really weak and they kind of missed the main nectar flow. And so I didn't get that much honey off of them. And that was when I realized the objective isn't just my bees lived. The objective should be more than that. It should be my bees are a strong, healthy colony capable of bringing in excess honey and thriving. You know, the goal isn't just to get a little couple handfuls of bees through the winter. We should have higher goals than that. And so you can, apparently, in my winter, in the case of one hive in one winter, you can get them through the winter on just honey. But, and I suspect the reason why they came through weak is that the bees, the winter bees are physiologically different bees. And so they live for up to 7 months. And so the bees that are being raised in August into early September for my area, and I think this holds true for most of Canada and therefore probably most of the US, the bees that are being raised in August and September are the bees that need to make it through to the following April. And so if you're not taking off honey, if you're letting your bees pack out the brood chambers with honey, so that they can overwinter just on honey, they're backfilling all that brood area that they should actually be using to raise their baby bees, so that you can get a strong colony through the winter. And so if you've let them pack out that whole brood chamber of honey at a time when they should be rearing brood in there, it's not possible to get a strong colony in April. And so that's why, for myself, I always fall feed so that I can have that maximum number of bees being produced in April through September. And then beginning of September, when I feel like they've produced all those winter bees, then I'll feed them and they can backfill the brood chamber because they're naturally collapsing their, they'll naturally collapse their brood nest once the nectar flow is done. And so it's all for me, the objective is like the strongest colonies I can get, not necessarily just a colony that happens to be alive still. I do in the springtime. I don't feed though. I don't do stimulative feeding in the springtime, which is unusual. But in the springtime, I like to have my overwintered bees make it through on their own reserves. And then as soon as we get the fresh nectar flow in the spring, I want them to just explode their brood nest and build up naturally on the first nectar flows. So it's more the springtime I see feeding as being optional in the springtime. But in terms of the fall, I don't know that we can really get a strong colony through to the next season without feeding. Because of that them needing to have a large brood nest to have bees to make it through the winter.
So it would be fair to say that as a beekeeper, you're managing your bees when normally they would just be surviving. You're managing them to maximize production.
Not to maximize. Well, for me, I do sell honey. So for me, it is an attempt to maximize production. But the production can be nukes. It can be honey. And there's also having a strong colony protects you from diseases. And so it's, so it's not managing to maximize production. It's managing to maximize the health of your bees. And then once you've maximized the health of your bees, by extension, you've maximized the productivity of them as well. But it's not the productivity I'm concerned about. It's that once you get into this thing where you have little tiny clusters of bees and they can't cover much brood area, and so they're, trying to lay out more than they can actually cover. And then on a cold night, they contract their cluster size and they get chilled brood, and you'll start seeing EFB issues and chalk brood, and you just get this kind of downward death spiral once you start having weak colonies. And so my objective isn't to maximize honey production, it's just to maximize their health. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about those diseases that sneak in when the bees get stressed.
Yeah, so the stress-related diseases primarily are considered to be chalk brood and European foul brood. European foul brood is kind of a collection of a few different types of bacteria, possibly. And so you can end up with sort of atypical EFB infections due to secondary bacteria and stuff. It's kind of a funny disease. And then chalk brood is caused by a fungus. And both of the diseases, chalk brood is caused by chilling events, cool weather, humid weather. When the larva gets chilled, chalk brood seems to do better. And then with EFB, it's transmitted through food, or I should say, the bacteria competes for food in the bee's gut, in the larva's gut. And so if the larvae aren't being fed well, the bacteria can outcompete the larva for food in the gut. And so the larva ends up starving and the bacteria ends up proliferating. And so both of them are caused by stressful conditions for the bees, not enough food, like not enough nectar flow. In the case of EFB, and chalk brood is like cool, wet weather, sort of variable weather, typically speaking. The diseases are all kind of changing a little bit now, but in the kind of conventional sense of these diseases, that's what causes them. And so if you can manage your colonies to sort of counteract the effects of the climate, basically, you can really mitigate those diseases. And that's without treatment. That's without anything. That's just trying to maintain the strong colonies. And if there is an extended dearth, feeding them helps prevent EFB, or helps to, prevent EFB, symptomatic EFB.
And even if you have very hygienic bees, that's a situation where they're not going to be strong enough to take care of it anyway.
Hygienic bees will help. Hygienic bees won't hurt for sure. So having hygienic bees is definitely one aspect of that. You can certainly kind of tip over the edge a little bit where you have hygienic bees. And then if the bees get stressed enough, you will start seeing signs of it for sure. The hygienic queens can't work miracles, We do need to help them out a little bit sometimes. So.
Well, and I haven't had any EFB that I've seen, but I have had, chalk brood at times in the spring. There'll be a weird weather event, and I get usually just one hive out of the group will get chalk brood occasionally. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that clears up on its own generally. Yeah, and that typically that's what one sees, is that it'll be weird spring weather. You'll have a hive or two. I've had good success actually with just relocating that hive. Sometimes I think, the bottom board is tipped a bit backwards and they're getting a bit more rain into that hive. Or there's just something about the little microclimate of that hive maybe. But if I relocate them and requeen them, the chalk brood goes away.
Yeah, and so we're starting to see more issues though with these really persistent. There's a lot of different strains of chalkbrood, and some are more virulent, so to speak, than others. And so there are some operations in my area that are starting to get this just sort of persistent, pervasive chalkbrood through their whole operation that is maintaining itself through the season. And so that's a bit more of a concern. But what you described is what I've seen in my operation as well. It's just, you'll have a hive or two in this spring, and then it mostly clears itself up. EFB I had never seen before in my bees before this summer. And my nectar flow it ended in the middle of July. It was really hot and dry or something this year. A lot of us had really bad nectar flows this year, but so the bees didn't have much to eat come middle of July, and I was being all hardcore with I'm not going to supplementally feed my bees. They should be able to live on their own. And by early August, mid-August, I was seeing signs of EFB in my colonies, and so that was where I was like, we have ideology, and then we have like, be a good beekeeper. And so I fed my bees. The ones that had the worst EFB, I gave them some antibiotics because they're good colonies. I've had them for 8 years now. I know they're good colonies. They just needed a bit of help because the weather was terrible this year, and so I don't know. That's my kind of philosophy: is you don't over medicate your bees, but when they need a bit of a nudge here and there, you help them out, because you can't expect them to be, immune to the environment. They do get affected by it. So, yeah, but that was the first time I'd ever seen EFB as well. It's not one of the more common diseases, I don't think.
Is chalkbrood infectious?
Chalkbrood is infectious, yes. Chalkbrood spores live for decades. The spores will get on equipment, so frames of drawn comb transferred between colonies can transfer chalkbrood. Hive tool smokers, hands will all transfer chalkbrood. Yeah. Yeah. EFB doesn't make spores, but the bacteria can live for around about a year, I believe. And so transferring equipment around can transfer EFB as well. But it's not one of the diseases where you can store equipment for 10 years and then bring it back into use and still have infective EFB on it.
Right.
So
yeah. For people that don't understand what spores are bacteria that when they encounter harsh conditions or not beneficial conditions, they will kind of dehydrate themselves and shrink down to a little pill sort of thing that is very durable and can withstand temperature extremes and moisture extremes. And then when conditions return to beneficial for their growth and reproduction, they can rehydrate themselves and become active infectious bacteria again.
That's pretty much bang on. The only part I would change is that it can be not just bacteria form spores, but like a fungus, a protozoa, a fungi. They can all form spores. But yeah, it's like a sexually reproducible unit that has formed a tough coating to endure unfavorable conditions for a very long time. And then when conditions become favorable, they can begin their vegetative reproduction stages again. Pretty much exactly what you said. Yeah. Right.
But the point is some diseases are spore forming and others aren't. Yes. So that's good. Like AFB, American foul brood, is spore forming. Chalkbrood is. And
nosema. Nosema forms spores as well. Nosema spores aren't as long lived. I think there's some nosema spores seem to live for a year to 3 years, maybe 5 years. Well, a year and more than a year. I'm not sure quite how long. It's not one of the super persistent ones. AFB and chalk brood live for decades. AFB can live for ever. And so yeah, but Nosema will form spores as well. So Nosema, chalk brood, and AFB form spores. EFB, sac brood, none of the viruses form spores. Yeah.
The viruses are by definition sort of not exactly living things.
If we go back to high school biology, that's what they tell us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. What should I talk about next? I was thinking about, well, we're sort of in the genre of diseases right now. One of your presentations showed laboratory tests of different hives and showed incidents of various viruses and other diseases even in healthy hives. So and from the numbers that I remember on your presentation, a lot of them were 100%.
Yeah. So all that was showing was that in our population of bees, we have asymptomatic viral or bacterial or fungal loads most of the time. And depending on your region of the continent and your source of bees, I guess, those viral loads and disease loads will change. But in a typical hive, there's always a background level of viruses and bacteria and stuff. And so that's where your hives will be asymptomatic and not bothered by these viruses and diseases until conditions become right for the diseases. And that might be a heavy varroa infestation. It might be cold, wet weather. It might be a lack of nectar flow. But once something tips to scales, that background level in your hives can turn into something that is symptomatic. And so that's where beekeeping practices can mitigate the line between symptomatic and asymptomatic disease loads in a hive.
So you practice your own hygienic, I use the word hygienic. You clean your tools and things rather than be a bit more laissez-faire about it like myself.
Yeah, and that's there is certainly a argument for not worrying about what the pathogen load is in a hive and placing the emphasis on having a hygienic or resistant queen of some sort who can, confer that trait to the worker bees in the hive so that they can maintain asymptomatic disease loads, or they can continue to be asymptomatic regardless of how heavy that disease load is in the hive. Like, if there is chalk brood in there, they will remain asymptomatic because they have a hygienic queen. And so that's the line of thinking in treatment, a line of thinking in TreatmentFree that I think is a valid perspective, particularly when you're running a lot of hives and you're breeding for that hygienic or resistant behavior. I don't run that many colonies, and so I've always thought I'm going to help them out as much as I can by not increasing that load of pathogens. And so I've always been really careful about sterilizing my hive tool. I beekeep with bare hands now, and I bring out a jug of water and soap and hand sanitizer. And whenever I see a hive that has like a touch of chalkbird or something's just weird, it's a weak colony and I'm not sure why, I sterilize all my stuff. And then I'll start working that hive last so that even if my sterilization doesn't kill everything from that hive, by working it last, at least I know that I won't be spreading it to the other hives in my apiary just because of the work order. And so that's the way I've approached it. My thinking is always to like help out the bees as much as I can, like do my part as a beekeeper to keep them healthy. And then also have hygienic queens and bees adapted to my area so that they can look after themselves too. But I don't want to be transferring diseases around and then hoping the bees can look after that. But for queen breeders, I think that's something that's a valid thing for them to be doing. Yeah. If that makes sense.
And just, to go back to a point I meant to make earlier, but I forgot. Mm-hmm. Well-adapted bees, it's always been my opinion that the best stimulative feeding in the spring is a well-adapted bee. And so stimulative feeding is not necessary, which is something you spoke to earlier. I see a lot of people, I liken it to feeding a rabbit. Like a rabbit's in a cage and you gotta feed, the little rabbit pellets and maybe some vegetables and a salt block and water. But bees, they really aren't in cages. They're free. In fact, they're supposed to go out and get their own food and bring it back here. And then, we harvest it and honey and whatnot. But yeah, it's, I see a lot of people that treat their bees like rabbits, like they have to be fed, like they're a dog or something. And I just like to get away from that.
Yeah. No, I see that too, where people are feeding their bees when they really don't need to be fed. But I think if you don't recognize when your bees need to be fed and when they don't need to be fed, erring on the side of feeding them is probably a good thing. Unnecessary, but not harmful. Arguably. I mean, would you think that unnecessarily feeding bees is harmful?
I don't know. It's probably not harmful to the hive unless you're doing it like we talked about in late fall and you're going to cause moisture issues and fermentation and things. My focus is more on feeding as treatment against starvation and coddling bees that should have been culled at some point, either by you or by your queen breeder or by somebody further back down the line who should have not kept this hive alive because it just can't deal with life. It can't bring in enough honey to survive or, for whatever reason. There's,
Yeah, I do, rightly or wrongly, I do agree with you. I can see, I, for my own colonies, I really like bees that can fly in cold weather, grab those spots on a rainy day when they can get out and get nectar, and, provide for their colony in the springtime when conditions might be a bit adverse, but there is nectar out there for them to get. I like having hardy spring colonies like that. But again, if you're a new beekeeper who doesn't, I recognize when my bees are near starvation. And this is where you and I differ again, perhaps, because if I have a colony that is, it got no nectar left in there and there's a week of cold weather coming up, I have in the past fed them like a quart of sugar syrup just to get that colony through. It's not something I do typically, but when I notice a colony is on the brink of starvation, I will feed that colony again. I don't, and then I won't breed off of it. I'll have mental note, do not breed off of that colony. But I don't just let them starve. And that's where, as a new beekeeper, if one can't recognize when the bees are potentially on the brink of starvation, it could be best just to feed them all the time in the spring to prevent them from starving. I mean, the ultimate objective is to be a good beekeeper, where you can recognize when your bees are on the brink of starvation. Or you can make the choice that you might of just let them starve. If they can't make it, let them starve, but at least you're consciously making that decision and not accidentally neglecting them and making a mistake.
I think that's a really good distinction. And one of the reasons why I'm not like a super purist when it comes to feeding is because, especially with new beekeepers, when you're starting out with a package or something, excuse me, when you're starting out with a package or, a small nuke or something like, or catch a swarm or something like that, it's in nature, if you look at Seeley's studies, the survival of a first year swarm is quite low, like in the range of, maybe a quarter. So if you're going to be a beekeeper, you're going to need, and you want to get that good start, you're probably going to need to help at least a little bit. But I make the distinction that ultimately the goal is to be working with bees that don't need that help. But it's okay, especially in the beginning, to get things moving. And you specifically being an experienced beekeeper as you are, you're able to make much more, judicious and justified decisions as to how to manage that and make that work. And same thing with me. We just have, slightly different criteria. And I kind of prefer, culling is going to happen. It happens in nature sometimes at extremely high levels. I think a lot of people don't even realize, in a bad year, how many feral hives will expire. But in my kept hives, I want to generate, especially if I have a plateau population, where I am where I want to be, I can purposely allow, some of these things to happen, allow culling to happen naturally, or do it manually, so that I'm continually winnowing away the weakest of the weak at the very minimum. But that's not exactly something a new beekeeper can or should be trying to do.
And I think that's one of the neat things about beekeeping, and why you can do this as a hobby or as a profession for your entire life and still be learning new things all the time, and still be trying new things all the time, is that we can all form our own objectives for how do we want to run our apiary, and then hang all our, I hesitate to even use the term management because some people don't even want to manage, but I'll use the term management. We can create our own objectives, and then we can manage however we choose to manage to best achieve our objective. And as an owner of bees, you can set whatever objective you want to set for yourself. So for me, it would be, not feeding in the springtime might be one of my big objectives, while being able to maintain a strong, healthy colony, which is certainly another one of my objectives. And then I'll base all my seasonal management around what my own objectives are. And so it's, I think, a process of kind of maturing as a beekeeper is coming up with your own objectives and your own management strategies to achieve those objectives. And it's not, I worry when other people tell us what our objectives should be, and this is what you should do to achieve my objective, which might not be your objective. And conversely, I worry about beekeeping. I don't worry about it that much, but for the sake of the argument, I worry about beekeeping when there is no objective and you're just following management strategies from an area that, from the internet, where it might not even be relevant to your area. And so you don't have a strong personal objective and you're following management strategies from some other location. That's kind of a recipe for bee death. And what happens in the beginning, I think, and then as you become more competent and mature as a beekeeper, the objectives and the management strategy that is specific for your area and your bees and your style of personality, that'll come in time. But it's something to consider. Yeah.
Well, before we go, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about. I'm a sort of an advocate of feeding granulated sugar if necessary. But you pointed out that is not something that you guys do up there in Canada. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does. It is not something we do. I don't know how else. I think we were talking about this in Alaska. Where did that come from? I'm curious about the origin of feeding granulated sugar, because there is, as far as I can tell, there's no history of that in Western Canada ever. Like, I don't think that was something that was ever tried, or maybe it was tried by a few people. I've never heard of it here before. I never have.
The only origin I'm aware of is it came from the forums. Some guy who went by the name of Mountain Camp on the forums started promoting it, and that was back in must have been the mid to late 90s, back in the early days of the internet. And it kind of caught on. I like it because it eliminates the moisture issues. I have a slight concern that thick sugar syrup that does end up, the bee's moisture ends up going into the sugar and turns it into really hard stuff, but it kind of seeps into the top bars of the frames in whatever box you have it in. And I'm not sure that might not cause rotting issues in the wood at some point, but I guess it hasn't so far. I haven't seen major problems with it, but that'd be interesting. But I like it because, the bees only take it when they need it. They really have no interest in it otherwise. And there's no robbing or moisture issues. And when they're done with it in the spring, they just leave it and you can come back and collect it back. But I mean, I would like to see if it would be useful up in your area. If it is, great. If it's not, then great. Then that'd be good information to know.
Yeah. I mean, it's never been used as far as I'm aware, and it's hard to, I'm sure beekeepers experiment all the time, so I'm sure at some point somewhere somebody has done this in Alberta, but it's not common practice. And I would suspect it's not common practice because it was found to not be necessary. And this is coming from the perspective of most of the beekeeping historically in Alberta has been commercial beekeeping for honey production. And so we don't we have a bit of a pollination industry now. In the last, 15, 20 years, a bit of a pollination industry has developed, but by and large, we have stationary beekeepers for honey production. And agriculture, it's a hard living. And if you're doing something that has a cost to it and you're not seeing a benefit to the bees, it won't persist. And so I would suspect that commercial beekeepers haven't seen a payoff to having the granulated sugar in the tops of the hives, would be my suspicion. It doesn't hurt the bees, but it doesn't do anything for them either. So it's not used. But
well, is there anything that you would like to say before we wrap it up?
No, I think that's everything. Yeah, that was
all right. Well, do you have any website or book or upcoming events you'd like to tell everybody about?
No. I have a website, but it's mostly, like I was saying, I mostly sell honey has been my big thing. So I do have a website. It's northcookinglake.wordpress.com. But if you were to go to that website, it's mostly about where you can buy my honey. And I will quite possibly be giving a few lectures this spring in Alberta. And I don't know how many people are listening from Alberta, but so no, I don't have much of an internet presence or book or anything presence, really.
I could actually get that information for you. I do have some listeners in Canada, not many.
Oh, you do?
I do have some. Well, Tracey, thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you joining me and talking about some of the same stuff that we talked about in person up in Alaska.
Yeah, it's nice chatting with you again.
This has been the Treatment-Free Beekeeping Podcast. Thanks for joining me again for this episode. If you've heard something that was interesting or useful to you, please consider becoming a patron of the podcast. You can start at just $1 a month and give however much you want to. So far, I've managed to keep the podcast completely free of advertisements and sponsorships, and between you and me, I'd like to keep it that way. Your support allows me to continue producing the podcast without having sponsorships and without having to read out advertisements like you hear on many other more commercialized podcasts. I enjoy those podcasts too, but I'd like to keep this one commercial free. You can become a patron at patreon.com/TFB. If you'd like to see me or hear me speak in person, I have a few events scheduled in 2018. We're doing a Skype presentation for the Bee Club in Idaho Falls, Idaho, Friday, February 2nd, coming up pretty soon at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Also, I'll be in Portland speaking to the Portland Urban Beekeepers on April 21st here in this spring, and that'll be an all-day seminar with a break for lunch, so that'll be nice. No 5-star reviews, but if you leave me a review on iTunes, I can read it on the show, and 5-star reviews will help other people find the show so we can spread the message about treatment-free beekeeping. This show is hosted, produced, and edited by me. My executive producer is Adam Blitz, and the show is brought to you by him and the other patrons at patreon.com/TFB. By supporting the show, you'll also get access to the TFB Pub on Facebook, which is a closed group for supporters of this podcast and the rest of the TFB stuff, because that's where all the money goes to. I'm about to tell you about that stuff, so hang on a second. The TFB Facebook group is at facebook.com/groups/treatment-free beekeepers, or you can just search for it. Group admins include Tony Holmes, Scott Offord, and Michael Cox. Moderators are Jason Bruns, Adam Blitz, Ed English, Chris Andrews, Mike Mahar, and Christina Chilcott. If you see any of these people posting on Facebook, give them a hearty thank you. They are all volunteers, and only once in a while do I buy them meals and things. The Treatment-Free Commercial Beekeepers group is at facebook.com/TFcommercial. And you can find my treatment-free beekeeping videos on YouTube at Treatment-Free Beekeeping. You can just search for that, or youtube.com/treatment-free beekeeping. The Treatment-Free Beekeeping forum is at forum.tfbees.net, and the admins there are Dusty and Michael Bush. My website is parkerbees.com, and once in a while I blog at parkerbees.blogspot.com. Thanks for joining me. I'm Solomon. Please share and rate this podcast whenever you get a chance. It helps other people hear about it and learn about treatment-free beekeeping. Theme music is by Jeb Bodiford. Credits music is by Nikolai Hadeless. And have fun keeping bees, because if you're not having fun, don't do it.